So I always felt like there was a big hole missing in the coverage of my community. There were good stories that needed to be told about our heroes. There were good people in my community, and all we heard about was the bad. But my parents had never gone to college, so my chances of someday doing that seemed very slim. And I also had a heavy Mexican accent. I would say, "These are my shoes, this is my shirt," and people would make fun of me because, as we know, there is no SH sound in Spanish. So I had to work on that. They would punish us at school for speaking Spanish. The coach had a big old paddle, a wooden paddle with holes drilled in it for extra speed and power, and they would spank us on our rear ends if they caught us speaking Spanish. My own teachers, when I would say I want to go to college, would look at me and say, "It's wonderful that you have this dream of someday being a television reporter, but we think you should try wood shop or metal shop or auto mechanics." They judged me by the color of my skin and the accent in my voice and the fact that no one in my family had gone to college. I would be the first one. And my first step was trying to get rid of my accent, right? Because I knew if I was going to be on television like Peter Jennings and Tom Brokaw and Dan Rather, my heroes, and Geraldo, I would have to work on my accent. I knew that they'd never hire someone with a heavy Mexican accent on television, on American television. I was just so committed. I really wanted it badly enough. I would not take no for an answer. Even though my teacher said, "You're not college material, it's not your turn. What gives you the audacity to think that you are college material when you have poor grades?" Because my grades weren't great. And I just didn't give up, I just believed in what my mother was telling me. She would say, "You're just as good as the kids who live on the other side of the tracks, in Alamo Heights, the rich part of town. You're just as good as them. It's just that you have to work on it a little bit harder right now, especially with English." And so then I went to a high school and I got to practice English. And it was there that I met my English teacher in the 10th grade. And we all have a teacher who makes a difference in our lives, right? Her name was Teresa Gutierrez, and she was my 10th grade English class. And she said to me, when she read my essays, she said, "I love the way you write and you tell stories. You're really good at this. Have you thought about journalism?" I said, "Of course. I've been watching Geraldo, listening to the radio all the time." And she said, "Well, I think you should meet the man who runs the school newspaper in my high school, the Brackenridge Times." So she introduced me to Mr. Harris, and he hired me as a reporter for the high school newspaper. So I've been a reporter since I was 13. And within a couple of months, I was the chief of editorials for the Brackenridge Times. I was named that. And so there I was doing these big investigative stories like, why are the teachers parking in the students' parking spaces? Tonight we go undercover and find out. And I loved it. And then along came another hero in my life, and heroes don't always have to be people. In my case, it was a government program called Upward Bound. Do you know Upward Bound? It's part of the government's TRIO programs, the war on poverty back in the 70s. It still exists today. The government steps into inner city high schools, and they take some students, and they give them extra courses on Saturdays, so that you're better equipped if you're going to go to college. So I went to this little school in San Antonio called St. Mary's University, a Catholic school. And at night, I had 3 jobs. You just got to work your tail off, man. You just got to be committed enough. My parents didn't have any money, so I had loans and grants. I worked in the geology department at the university, sorting rocks. And I worked in the cafeteria during, at lunchtime. And then at night, I was a drugstore delivery man for this local pharmacy in San Antonio. I would drive a beat-up Volkswagen, and I would bring little old ladies and older gentlemen their medicine that they couldn't get themselves. I would deliver it to their front door. But the owner of that pharmacy was a Mexicano, Richard Teniente, and he, at night, between my deliveries, I had a little cassette recorder, and I would record my voice, and I would grab whatever I could read, right, and record, read it into my tape recorder, and then play it back to try to work on my accent. And one night he heard me through the men's room door when I came out, he goes, "You really want to go into broadcasting?" I said, "Sí, yes." He said, "Okay, well, I know the general manager of a radio station here in San Antonio, and they're looking for interns." And the reason they were looking for interns was because in San Antonio at the time, there were very few people who looked like me or us on television or very few Hispanics on the radio, maybe with 3 or 4 in the whole city of 1 million people. And there I was, you know, after practicing on my cassette. And one of the radio stations that hired me was KKYX, this country music station. I was 18, and I didn't like country music, but it was an opportunity. Now I like it now, but back then, not so much. And then they let me do something on the air for the first time, you know. There would be a national commercial out, and I got to tell you where you could buy the medicine for a drug company, right? So I got to say, the first words I ever said on the radio were, I got to say, now available at Walgreens. And that was it. That was so fun. I was so proud of myself. And I would call my tios and my mother and sisters, you got to listen at 1:12 this afternoon, but don't blink, you know. But that's how you start. That's how you start. And from there, I just kept going. I just didn't take, no one would hire me in television in San Antonio, in Texas. I tried in San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, Amarillo, McAllen, everywhere in San Antonio, in Texas, no one would hire me because they all had their one Hispanic reporter. And it was like, we have one already, we don't need another one. And it was horrible. And I was depressed because I wanted to go into television. So much so that I decided that I would go to law school. I said, well, you know, I'm going to give up journalism because I'm making $800 a month at a radio station in Houston. You know, half of that goes to pay my rent. So I thought, this isn't going to work. And I went to one more audition for a public affairs program in Houston that would air on Sunday nights, like Sunday mornings, like 1 in the morning. It was called Reflejos del Barrio, you know, Reflections from the Barrio. And I auditioned for that. And one of the people there auditioning was a Puerto Rican woman from New York, whose name was Merimil Rodriguez. And I told her my story. She was a good journalist. She was already writing for the newspaper, making good money at the Houston Chronicle, but she was trying to get into television. And I told her my story. I said, this is terrible. I'm gonna give up on journalism because I want to try to go to law school. And she said, no, John, you have such a passion for telling stories. You know, you'd be a lousy lawyer. You'd be bored to death. She said, I went to Columbia University in New York, the Graduate School of Journalism, this Ivy League school. And it's a wonderful school, and you get a master's in 1 year, 9 months. And if you want to go there, why don't you try that? If you're going to go back to school, why not go to grad school in journalism and get a master's instead of a law school? And if you want to go, I'll write a letter for you. So Merimil wrote this letter for me, and I was accepted into Columbia University. In 1979, I moved to New York, like the Beverly Hillbillies with a trailer and all my stuff in the truck, and we moved to New York City. And in 1 year, I got a master's, and then I wound up going to Chicago. I got a job in Chicago television, which is unheard of. And while I was there, I did a story that I wanted to do for a long time about an issue that's still a hot button issue today, immigration, right? Illegal immigration. Even back then, 40 years ago, you know, the situation was the same as it is right now along the Rio Grande, although back then it was mainly Mexicanos, you know, coming to this country. Now it's Central Americans and many other people. So I convinced my news director in Chicago to let me do this big story on immigration. And I said, I want to go undercover. I want to go to Mexico. I was 26, right? I want to go to Mexico and I want to pose as a Mexican citizen trying to get into the US. And I want to see if I can find a coyote, you know, a smuggler, who will bring me across. And my news director said, that's a great idea. Are you sure you want to do this? I said, yeah, I think I can pull it off because I'm Mexicano anyway, I speak Spanish. And so he said, okay. But the day after my story aired on CBS in Chicago, my story about swimming across the Rio Grande and how risky that is and how life-threatening it can be, the story of me working at that restaurant where the owner was abusing and taking advantage of all those Mexicanos. The day after it aired on CBS in Chicago, the US government moved in, they shut down the restaurant, they arrested the owner of the restaurant, and they got the Mexicanos the money they were owed, the workers, and temporary visas to remain in this country while they worked on their residency. And I knew then that those are the kinds of stories that as a Chicano, as a Latino, I could tell in this country better than anyone, right? Who else can go undercover like that? I see journalism as I call it the candle in the darkness. You know, imagine we're in this room right here and there's been a terrible storm outside and we're all locked in and everything's dark, the electricity's out, and we can't see our hands in front of our faces. Well, I think the journalist, he or she, is the person with a little candle or the little flashlight, and they can shine it on the darkest corners of the room to illuminate injustice, to illuminate corruption, to illuminate human rights violations and civil rights violations. I think when journalism is done right, those are the kinds of stories that we should be doing. And who better to tell them than someone who's from that community? Certainly stories about the Latino community, you need a Latino who speaks Spanish, who looks Latino, who understands not only the language, but the mannerisms and the customs of our people. I find that those people open up to me because they don't see me so much as an outsider. And that story of me swimming across the Rio Grande and working at that restaurant won my first Emmy award. ABC News in New York was watching, and they offered me a job to cover Latin America. And it was my dream come true. That's what I always wanted to be, like Geraldo on ABC, right? But it was that story. If I hadn't done that story, I don't know that I would have gotten there. I just had to keep pushing and pushing and risking and throwing it all out there.